For my first source, I'd like to share with you some insight from the blog titled The Futurist. The article in question is called The Misandry Bubble. This article is a doozy, and it starts off with a lot of anti-feminist rhetoric. Let's look at some now. Executive summary. The Western world has quietly become a civilization that has tainted the interaction between men and women, where the state forcibly transfers resources from men to women, creating various perverse incentives for otherwise good women to inflict great harm onto their own families, and where male nature is vilified but female nature is celebrated. This is unfair to both genders, and is a recipe for a rapid civilizational decline and displacement, the costs of which will ultimately be borne by a subsequent generation of innocent women rather than men as soon as 2020. I wish I could say something specific to debunk this claim, but it's so unsubstantiated that I'm reduced to having to say, citation needed? Now, the basic premise of this article is that men and women are equally valuable but have different strengths and weaknesses, and different priorities. A society is strongest when men and women have roles that are complementary to each other, rather than of an adversarial nature. Furthermore, when one gender, either one, is mistreated, the other ends up becoming disenfranchised as well. If you disagree with this premise, you may not wish to read further. Oh good, so I'll get a chance to talk about sex role theory. Alright, so get this. The mentality that's being displayed in this paragraph is actually a feminist form of discourse that has existed for generations, and it all stems from this concept called sex role theory. This is extended from a form of logic that has been started in the field of sociology that's most well known as structural functionalism. The idea of structural functionalism is that society is healthiest when everybody plays their part. That sounds fun in theory, and functionalism is a theory after all, but it also extends to a micro level too. The nuclear family as a unit of society in microcosm requires that every member of the family play their part. This is where sex role theory comes into play. The idea in sociology around the time of the 1950s was more conservative, that in order to maintain a healthy society and a healthy family, a man must play the traditional roles of breadwinner, father, husband, and, well, man. He must provide for the family and he must protect the family. He must be a stern, stoic authority figure, and so on. Conversely, the woman must play the traditional roles of homemaker, mother, wife, and, well, woman. The idea was if we want to deal with social issues, we must deal with them through rigid adherence to a conservative, traditional nuclear family model. As long as we all play our part, things will be fine. It's worth noting that this idea is still adopted by evangelical Christian families. They even have a word for it. They call it complementarianism. Well, it turns out that things really weren't fine. The 1950s were a fucking disaster for families and for society as a whole. Mothers often turned to alcoholism and painkillers to drown out the misery of being forced into a motherly caregiving role. Fathers would often abuse their children or their wives, and part of this was a result of stress from being pushed to maintain that traditional father role. Children grew up to be horribly nervous that if they showed signs of being abused, that would reflect poorly on their family, and so a lot of children grew up traumatized and neglected. The failure of conservative functionalism in the 50s led to the development of sexual theory within liberal feminism in the 60s and 70s. Sexual theory is one that recognizes the potential for inequality and argues that reducing inequality requires allowing women and men to adhere to gender roles, but also making certain to change the gender roles themselves, to best foster a sort of complementary but equal mentality. It was best outlined in Connell's article Theorizing Gender. Women's disadvantages are attributed mainly to stereotyped customary expectations, held by both women and men, which keep women back from professional advancement and create prejudice and discrimination against them. In principle, then, sex inequalities can be eliminated by measures to break down the stereotypes and redefine the roles. Among them are giving girls better role models, bringing in the anti-discrimination laws, establishing equal opportunity programs in education and employment, and the like. This freeing up of social convention may even be to the advantage of men. Now, when anti-feminists say they don't dislike all of feminism, just third-wave feminism, they really mean they like second-wave liberal and conservative approaches to feminism. They either like the more traditionalist approach of functionalism, where women are forced into a more motherly and caregiving role, or they like the sex role theory approach, in which women are treated with dignity and are given positive roles and role models, but are still essentially different from men, and that this should be recognized. So this paragraph in the Misandry Bubble article is actually rooted in some small degree of feminist leanings. That's not to say that the person who wrote the article is a feminist or is pro-feminist, just that the starting point idealizes a form of equality that can be achieved through recognizing differences between men and women, which is something that is very popular among some older forms of feminism and continues to be popular in some feminist circles to this day. I bring this up for two reasons. The first is that this idea of equality through difference rather than through the elimination of difference is an extremely reductive understanding of social issues relating to gender. Whether or not the goal of something like sex role theory is functionalism or not, what it boils down to is functionalism. It argues that if we can create an ideal societal structure where women and men have different places within the structure that are beneficial, then maintaining that structure is the best way to allow society to prosper. The world doesn't work in such a way that rigid structures are the ideal for an ever-changing natural and social world surrounding us. I mean, sure, you can argue that, for example, architecture can benefit from rigid design that withstands erosion and natural disasters. But evolution, by contrast, is highly malleable, and naturally so. And so if we look at how creatures engage with survival, the way they behave changes drastically over time to adapt to new situations. And this is why some species die out while others survive. The same is true of the social world. Famously, the role of women in American society in the era of World War II changed drastically from being largely caregivers and largely confined to the homes or to specific professions to being heavily involved in manual labor to help the war effort in the absence of large numbers of men who were overseas fighting the war. Now, this idea that men and women are essentially different, which I'll cover in more detail later, breaks down here because the idea that women shouldn't, for example, do manual labor because they don't have the physique or the testosterone needed to do so becomes meaningless when we look at women's role in the war efforts of World War II. It also breaks down when we look at women in the military or in the police force or anything of that sort. Maintaining the supposed differences between men and women as unchanging pillars of gender roles in society undermines the need for us as a species and as a society to constantly adapt to new developments in our surrounding world. Rigidity simply does not work as a model for creating a prosperous society. The second reason why I bring this up is because what the misandry bubble is doing is a bit of a shady move. By starting with an ideal that sounds vaguely reasonable to both feminist-friendly folks and anti-feminists, the rest of the article can pretend to seem legitimate as it devolves into utter bullshit, and it goes there quickly. The myth of female oppression. When you tell someone that they are oppressed against all statistical and logical evidence, you harm them by generating discouragement and resentment. This pernicious effect is the basis of many forms of needlessly inflicted female unhappiness, as well as the basis for unjustified retaliation against men. First of all, the framing of this as a logical issue is a bit strange to me, because you can use all sorts of logic, but when discussing the nature of oppression, oppression is much more easily measurable in statistics than in arguments. Granted, there still needs to be some form of reasonable argument put forth when presenting statistics of any kind, because when it comes to social issues, how the issue is framed is very important, not just the raw data itself. But, in a rather expected manner, this article doesn't provide much in terms of statistical reasoning and provides very little in terms of logical reasoning. But the clever little thing that this paragraph does is that it frames things on intellectually dishonest and othering terms. By saying that women's oppression is against all statistical and logical evidence, a claim that is not substantiated within this article whatsoever, it automatically sounds as though there is a fact of the matter in which women are not actually being oppressed. So let's talk about it. Are women being oppressed? Well, that requires doing two things. First, it requires defining oppression, and then it requires looking at statistics that demonstrate that women, by definition, are being oppressed. So first, the definition of oppression, the one that sociologists use and by extension the one that feminists are using when they say that women are being oppressed. Courtesy of ThoughtCo. Social oppression refers to oppression that is achieved through social means and that is social in scope. It affects whole categories of people. Oppression is the systematic mistreatment, exploitation, and lowering in status of a group or groups of people by another group or groups. It occurs when a group holds power over others in society by maintaining control over social institutions and society's laws, rules, and norms. The outcome of oppression is that groups in society are sorted into different positions within the social hierarchies of race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability. Those in the controlling or dominant group benefit from the oppression of other groups through heightened privileges relative to others, greater access to rights and resources, a better quality of life and healthier life, and overall greater life chances. Those who experience the brunt of oppression have less access to rights and resources than those in the dominant groups, less political power, lower economic potential, often experience worse health and higher mortality rates, and have lower overall chances of life. So, in order to know whether or not women are being oppressed, we need to be able to demonstrate that men have a systemic disadvantage over women, that men control our social institutions, laws, and norms, and that women have less political power and less overall life chances. So let's start with political power. This will be a bit of a US-centric analysis, but to be fair, anti-feminists tend to be very centered on the West and often say that oppression against women exists in third world countries, but not here in the West. So we're going to just stick with the US for now to counteract that claim. Here are some statistics, according to Catalyst.org. In US government, women hold only 19% of the seats in the House of Representatives, meaning 84 out of 435. Additionally, women only hold 21 of the 100 seats in the Senate. We have never had a woman as president in the United States, and we've only had one Speaker of the House of Representatives be a woman, Nancy Pelosi. There are only 4 US governors that are women, only 24% of US state legislators are women. Additionally, only 3 of the 9 Supreme Court justices are women. Statistically speaking, women do not represent even 30% of any of the major branches of government at federal or state levels. So, statistically speaking, men hold an overwhelming majority of the power in the US government, and by that token, men construct the laws and hold power over one of the major social institutions. But just to substantiate this further, let's cover 2 other major social institutions in America: corporations and media. Catalyst.org updates us on the numbers for corporations. In 2016, women held 51.5% of management and professional positions. That's a good sign. That's the first statistic so far in which women were generally equal with men. However, women only hold 5.2% of CEO positions in major companies and make up only 20.2% of board seats in major companies. As a result, the corporations with the most power have the majority of the most powerful positions occupied by men, with lower level positions being more egalitarian, but with higher level positions being the ones that have the most power. Consequently, men dominate the social institutions of the quote-unquote free market as well. Now on to media. According to WomenInHollywood.com, women in the highest grossing movies of 2017 were 8% of the directors, 10% of the writers, 2% of cinematographers, 24% of producers, and 14% of editors. In TV during the 2016-2017 network season, women were only 28% of all creators, directors, writers, producers, executive producers, editors, and DPs. 85% of programs had no women as directors for any of the episodes, and 67% had no women writers. This shows a staggering inequality on the part of the major social institutions in the United States. Men control the government, men control the corporations, and men control the media. Emphatically so. Men control the social institutions and laws, rules, and norms as a result. By definition, the one that feminists use, and by extension the one that this misandry bubble article is using in order to combat feminist claims, women are being oppressed. This cannot be debated unless you want to reject the statistical and logical reasoning that you argue that feminists don't have. Now back to the article. All of us have been taught how women have supposedly been oppressed throughout human existence, and that this was pervasive, systematic, and endorsed by ordinary men who did not face hardships as severe as what women endured. In reality, this narrative is entirely incorrect. The average man was forced to risk death on the battlefield, at sea, or in mines, while most women stayed indoors tending to children and household duties. Male life expectancy was always significantly lower than that of females, and still is. Warfare has been a near constant feature of human society before the modern era, and whenever 2 tribes or kingdoms went to war with each other, the losing side saw many of its fighting-age men exterminated, while the women were assimilated into the invading society. Now, becoming a concubine or a housekeeper is an unfortunate fate, but not nearly as bad as being slaughtered in battle as the men were. To anyone who disagrees, would you like for the men and women to trade outcomes? Okay, so this is something that is going to become a constant theme recurring among men's rights activists and red pillars, which is the conflation of race and class-based oppression with male oppression. There are 3 things wrong with what this article is saying, and these same 3 things will be true of many, many articles written by these kinds of people. First, The treatment of men as expendable is partially a form of class-based oppression. Historically, the wars you're speaking of were not fought by the rich or the rulers of the land, but by their subordinates. Using a more contemporary example, World War II, the men who went to fight in the war were not the rich men, they were the middle and working class men. So when you say it's men being put into war to die, you're missing that it's specifically men of lower class statuses in society, not all men, and especially not rich men. So part of this is a failure to understand that men can be oppressed on a class basis. Second, the issue of men being devalued in such a way actually brings with it misogynistic undertones. Women are not unoppressed by virtue of men being devalued by those in power. Those in power write the rules for our society, and they govern a world in which poor men and men of color are of lesser value than the men in power, who are typically white men. But they also do the same for women, and in a very sexist manner, the men in power determine that women are too weak and feminine and are better to stay home and mother children and procreate. Women are treated as currency for procreation in this situation, and that's demeaning and also oppressive. Like, even if we agree that some men are oppressed in this scenario, it does not give women power over men. Third, the issues that men face are extensions of patriarchy, not proof that patriarchy doesn't exist. Patriarchal norms push men into a position of anguish, and this isn't okay. This is something that feminists have acknowledged for a few decades now. The idea that feminists don't care about men is a straw man of feminism, a movement that historically has been more and more receptive to dealing with men's issues each year. I mean, literally, the fact that I am making this video right now is evidence of this, because I'm acknowledging men's issues while putting them in their proper context. The misandry bubble goes on to point out two things: that comparing the average woman to the men with the most power rather than to the average man is the apex fallacy, and that male circumcision is a mutilation practice that is seen as totally fine, while female circumcision is seen as mutilation. This apex fallacy bullshit is some prime intellectual dishonesty. This article is addressing feminist claims, but not actually linking to almost any at all, and is constructing a straw man. You might notice that I just a minute ago was comparing women to men in positions of power to argue that women are oppressed. The apex fallacy claim may portray what I did as though it's a logical fallacy when, in fact, it's not. I didn't compare the average women to men in positions of power. I compared women in positions of power to men in positions of power to demonstrate that even within the realm of those with power, women represent a huge minority of power in society. I then argued that the average woman is oppressed by men in power because men hold the majority of powerful positions compared to women in positions of power. I am not comparing the experience of the average woman to the experience of men in power. I'm demonstrating why men holding power is, by definition, indicative of women's oppression. As for the male circumcision claim, I have good news for men's rights activists. I outright condemn male circumcision. I believe it's genital mutilation, and I will look down on parents who choose to circumcise their children. I think it's disgusting that people do it. And guess what? So do lots of feminists. This is another flaw in men's rights and red pill circles. Constructing issues that men face as though feminists don't show concern for them, when we often do, and we understand these issues in much more depth and with much more nuance. Certainly some pop feminists and white feminists will have that passive-aggressive mentality of being shitty to men over everything, and that is a genuine problem, and that does reflect poorly on feminism. But saying that there are feminists who make fun of men for being forcibly circumcised is somehow evidence that women are not oppressed, that's a huge stretch. Unlike the misandry bubble, an article that, while completely unsubstantiated and lacking in citations and making a lot of stretches, at least tries to seem a bit more academic and credible, our next article, The Red Pill Constitution, courtesy of Illimitable Men,
destroy your delusions, actualize your potential, cultivate your masculinity,
is almost hilariously indicative of just how far gone a red pillar can sometimes be from basic sensibility. Feminists crave privileges which consolidate the realm of male power with that of the female. Typically, they are traditionalist in ways which benefit women. Men pay for dates. Pressure to perform is squarely on men. But progressive, where traditionalism would limit their power. Intolerance for female promiscuity. A reluctance to trust women with leadership. This is achieved by glossing over the influence of feminine soft power in society, influence and charm, and comparing men and women solely in hard power, economic and political. In taking this highly one-sided approach to power, Feminists play upon humanity's propensity to take pity on women, and where the myth of female powerlessness is bought into, more power is redistributed to them. First of all, feminists are not a monolith. We don't all desire traditionalism in ways that benefit us, and in fact, a lot of us don't. Secondly, what the hell is this about feminine soft power in society? Charm is not a power, it's a nebulous concept and it can't be quantified or qualified at all. Third, influence is measured in terms of economic and political power, and this can be quantified. And I did earlier in this video, so I'll refer you back to that. Women do not have influence over society. They do not control the media or the government or corporations. But this section does demonstrate two things about red pill philosophy. One, their tendency to lump everything into false dichotomies, and two, their ability to use words in a way that sounds compelling and plays into sympathies that their audiences already have, but is actually totally meaningless when you break down what the statements really mean. Feminism is nothing more than a female supremacy movement posing as one of humanist egalitarianism. Feminism highlights female incompetence in areas where men excel, redefines them as injustices by blaming men for female ineptitude, and then legally mandates the promotion of women within said areas. As such, women consistently make social gains in areas where men have traditionally dominated. Female supremacy movement? Sorry, I think you're confusing us with TERFs. As for the whole feminism redefines female incompetence as injustice, it's actually hard to even explain why this is wrong because it's just so out of left field, but I will explain it. First, I need to give some context for why there even was a second wave feminist movement. Women historically were doing a lot of the work that men did leading up into the Second World War, including factory work and intensive manual labor. But things got a little weird once the war was over. I'm going to quote an excerpt from Stephanie Coontz's book, The Way We Never Were, from the section titled Leave It to Beaver and Ozzie and Harriet, American Families in the 1950s. Women's retreat to housewifery, for example, was in many cases not freely chosen. During the war, thousands of women had entered new jobs, gained new skills, joined unions, and fought against job discrimination. Although 95% of the new women employees had expected when they were first hired to quit work at the end of the war, by 1945 almost an equally overwhelming majority did not want to give up their independence, responsibility, and income, and expressed the desire to continue working. After the war, however, writes one recent student of post-war Reconstruction, management went to extraordinary lengths to purge women workers from the auto plants, as well as from other high-paying and non-traditional jobs. As it turned out, in most cases, women were not permanently expelled from the labor force, but were merely downgraded to lower-paid female jobs. Even at the end of the purge, there were more women working than before the war, and by 1952, there were 2 million more wives at work than at the peak of wartime production. The jobs available to these women, however, lacked the pay and the challenges that had made wartime work so satisfying, encouraging women to define themselves in terms of home and family even when they were working. The push to get women out of the workforce after World War II was heavy and deliberate. This was not a result of incompetence at all. It was a result of a massive push towards conservatism in American society. After all, if the women were incompetent, then they wouldn't have been able to do the work it took to help the war effort, and we might not have even won the war. Women did their duty, and they busted their asses off, and they proved that they can competently do all of the hard work that men can do, only to be kicked out of the workforce by men after World War II is over. It actually gets even worse, though. Let's read a bit more from Coontz. Women who could not walk the fine line between nurturing motherhood and castrating momism, or who had trouble adjusting to creative homemaking, were labeled neurotic, perverted, or schizophrenic. A recent study of hospitalized schizophrenic women in the San Francisco Bay Area during the 1950s concludes that institutionalization and sometimes electric shock treatments were used to force women to accept their domestic roles and their husbands' dictates. Shock treatments also were recommended for women who sought abortion on the assumption that failure to want a baby signified dangerous emotional disturbance. All women, even seemingly docile ones, were deeply mistrusted. They were frequently denied the right to serve on juries, convey property, make contracts, take out credit cards in their own name, or establish residence. A 1954 article in Esquire called Working Wives a Menace. A Life author termed married women's employment a disease. Women were excluded from several professions, and some states even gave husbands total control over family finances. There were not many permissible alternatives to baking brownies, experimenting with new canned soups, and getting rid of stains around the collar. So what does this all establish? Well, it establishes first and foremost that women were able to do the hard work and wanted to do the hard work. Second, it establishes that women were severely punished for attempting to break away from a traditionally feminine role. Third, it establishes the reason why modern feminist efforts began and still continue to this day. Fourth, and this is important, even if women were incompetent, if women somehow became super incompetent at all the things that made women during World War II so great, that is not an isolated incident. It has cultural and systemic implications. Even if women were incompetent at all of the things that men dominate at, which we aren't, then that would still be the fault of the system forcing women into submissive, subservient, and traditionally feminine positions. This is precisely why we even have the phrase male-dominated, because it's a situation in which women are incapable of breaking through for systemic reasons, not for individual reasons. For the sake of cutting down time, I'm going to summarize the third article because it keeps arguing the same basic point over and over again. This article is from Return of Kings, and it's called How Feminism Wrecked the Social Contract Between the Sexes. The basic argument that each example of the article is trying to make is, things used to be better when we had more traditional, pre-second wave feminism standards for society and for men and women. And my response to that is, institutionalization and sometimes electric shock treatments were used to force women to accept their domestic roles and their husbands' dictates. So you can return that social contract to the ass that you pulled it from. Quickly, just to wrap up, I'd like to give a shout out to my friend Justice for doing a small bit of voice acting for this video. Justice is a great amateur voice impressionist, and I appreciate the help. I'd like to also give an addendum to this video. I mentioned earlier how women were instrumental in helping the World War II effort in the United States, and I'd like to make it clear that these points were for the sake of argument and don't reflect my political views necessarily. So just for clarity's sake, I am not in favor of pro-war or pro-nationalistic approaches to feminism, and I don't want my arguments to imply any sort of respect for United States military actions. I'd also like to add that while this series will often have to hold a cis-centric lens while discussing gender depression and reproductive rights, I want to also be clear that I intend for this to extend to an intersectional analysis. Reproductive rights affect women from all sorts of marginalized backgrounds and identities, not just cis, hetero, white, able-bodied women. Even more specifically, reproductive rights can affect trans women in ways that are often overlooked by these conversations. Thanks for watching.